Balancing Act by Mirella Sands. Read by Gwynneth Rausch. Argy stared at the open bronze gates of the city of Tezeran. Her acrobatic troupe had never performed here before. No one had, at least for a profit, if the rumors were correct. The Tezerine were famous for their wealth, but also for disliking dance, song, acrobatics, and pretty much any entertainment. With the southern wars raging and a drought in the northern territories, options were limited though. Tezeran was a bad bet, but this summer it was the only bet to make. "That's not much of a wall," said Savina quietly. True enough. The black basalt wall of the city rose perhaps only 6 or 7 feet, hardly a barrier for anyone besides children and small animals. Savina sat in front of Argy on the horse, since they had no spare for her right now. Argy was slim and Savina only 12, and the horse could easily carry them both. Besides, Savina, who had until recently been a slave, seemed comforted by staying as near to Argy as possible. And Argy liked having the girl within the circle of her arms. She'd never had a child or little sister to care for, and she had found she liked the feeling. "What happens when they're attacked?" asked Savina, which drew a snort from Maori, who sat on the horse next to them. "No one's ever attacked Tezeran," said Argy with a smile. "Not that I heard of, anyway. Maybe it's too hard to get an army across the desert." Maori climbed off his horse and approached the gate guards. Even though this was Argy's troupe, she didn't mind Maori being the face of the troupe around strangers. He was more imposing, and his deep voice seemed to automatically weigh more heavy with people. She waited silently while he spoke with the guards, who didn't even carry spears. After a short exchange, Maori stomped back to where the rest of the troupe waited. Argy leaned forward. "Well?" Maori shrugged. His night-dark skin was covered in sweat, even this early in the day. He rubbed some of it away. "They say we're welcome to come in," he said in his rough northern accent. "There's plenty of room in the central plaza for us and the horses. Water is freely available and the market has enough goods for us to buy what we need." "They don't want a fee to let us enter?" asked Savina. Maori spared the girl a warm smile. Maori and Argy had found Savina at a slave market, performing a dance for the delight of the crowd. Her natural limberness and fearlessness had excited both of them, and Argy knew they had to have her for the troupe. She and Maori had managed to buy the girl and had subsequently freed her. The price for her freedom had been to indenture herself to Argy until her 18th name day. By the time she was 18, she would be a long-time veteran of the troupe and should know if she wanted to stay or make a different life for herself. If she were anything like the rest of the troupe, she would stay. "No, they don't," said Maori. "We don't have to pay to stay in the plaza either." Yalan, their juggler, snorted through his generous moustache. "What kind of city magistrate doesn't charge gate fees and camp fees?" Maori looked back at the gates briefly and shrugged again. "Maybe they're rich enough they don't care to pick our pockets for a few coins." Savina's blue eyes got very round. How could they get rich way out here? There's only rocks and sands for miles. "Water," said Argy. "They control it. If you want to cross the desert, you'll have to negotiate with the Tezerine to have enough water." "Which we will need as well," said Kalle, their animal handler. He and Yalan were twins and looked almost alike, with their bald heads and green eyes and hairy arms. They differed in that years ago, an obstinate mule had bitten off the little finger of Kalle's right hand. "Let's go," said Argy. Maori got back on his horse, and Argy led the troop forward. The guards let them pass without even a glance. The city was large, and the streets full of pedestrians and animals, but an air of gloom seemed to hang over everything. People walked quickly, with their eyes on their feet. Where Argy would have expected small groups of old women to be gossiping, or gangs of teenagers running through the side streets, there were simply people walking by themselves, hurrying on their way. "Strange city," said Maori. "Bet we don't make any money here." "Let's wait and see," said Argy. As they approached the central plaza, Argy grew concerned. The gaily coloured tents of other troops already took up much of the available space. Her group was not the first to try their luck in Tezeran this summer. By now, the other acts may have taken whatever money the Tezerine were willing to part with for entertainment. Still, they had to try. Otherwise, they'd have to find some other work. And what was she suited to do besides balancing on a rope or performing sleight of hand? Besides, breaking up the troupe would break Argy's heart. They might not be the largest troupe or the most talented, but they were family, much more of a family than any of them had ever had before. Argy picked an area that was large enough and still unoccupied, and dismounted. The others sprang to their tasks, well practiced with how to get their camp up and running with a minimum of fuss. "Well, look what the goddess spit out on the poor Tezerine," said a familiar voice. Argy turned with a smile. "Vula!" The other woman rushed forward and enveloped Argy in a hug. Argy returned the hug and planted a kiss on Vula's weathered cheek. "You got here before we did. Did you take all the money there is to be had already?" Vula's tanned face cracked into a laugh. "We've been trying, but the Tezerine don't part with much. We don't have any animals, though. Maybe you'll have better luck. Everyone likes animals." Vula looked just over Argy's shoulder. "You've a new addition." Argy held out her arm, and Savina snuggled against her. "We found her in Lilinan, dancing for her supper. She'll make a great addition to the troupe." Vula nodded. She knew as well as anyone that no free girl Savina's age would have been dancing for strangers in Lilinan. "I thought you didn't keep slaves." Savina stiffened slightly, and Argy held her more tightly. Though Savina generally exuded a plucky and happy countenance, she often had trouble sleeping and sometimes had nightmares. Argy hadn't asked, but she suspected Savina's happy act was for show because her owners had demanded it of her. One day, Savina might trust Argy enough to let her guard down, but it hadn't happened yet. "She's free now," said Argy. "You know me better than that." She looked down at the girl. "Savina, fetch Vula some water." The girl smiled and dashed off. Vula stepped closer and traced a line down Argy's body from her collarbone to her navel in a familiar gesture that made Argy shiver in the most delightful way. "Indeed, I know you very well, and I should like to get reacquainted once you're settled. I've got some good wine. The Tezerine make the best. I can promise we won't be disturbed until dawn." Argy laughed. The last time Vula had stayed in Argy's tent, Maori had wandered in looking for something and had been surprised to catch Argy and Vula in an intimate embrace. He had fled the tent, with his dark face even darker from embarrassment, and had never spoken of the incident since. Not that he was some kind of innocent. Life on the road meant the two had often found comfort in each other's beds, and Argy had been with everyone in her troupe at some point, even Maori. But for all his fondness for sex, and for all his love of bawdy drinking songs, Maori drew the line at discussing intimate matters out loud, or observing others participating in them. It was one of the things Argy found most charming about him. At least she knew when she slid under his blanket, he wouldn't be discussing what happened there with anyone else. "So tell me," she said to Vula, "along with the wine and the invitation to share your bed, would you also have some information about this city, besides that they're tight with their money?" Vula waved her hands in a gesture of futility. "They're an odd bunch, that's for sure. If you can get them to pay for a performance, they drop gold like it's nothing to them. But most of the time, they wander around alone or in small groups, always watching their feet. When you ask why, they say the god of shadows demands they keep their eyes down." God of shadows? Apparently who they worship here. I guess living under the desert sun, where there's rarely a cloud, means you find shadows more comforting than light. You'll see. When the sun goes down, they'll be in a better mood. Toward dawn, they start slouching and scurrying again, like mice. "So, only night performances," said Argy. Vula laughed and nodded. "Absolutely." Yalan walked up to the two women. "Hey, Vula," he said with a cheery wave. "Good to see you." Vula nodded at him. "Argy," said Yalan, "Calais says the monkey isn't looking too good in the heat. He wants to spend some money on extra fruit for him." "Sure," said Argy. "Say, did you see Savina anywhere? I sent her for water for Vula, but she hasn't returned." "No, haven't seen her. Maybe Maori has." "Fine. Let Calais know he should do whatever he can for the monkey. He makes more money than any of us." "Ain't that the truth?" muttered Yalan as he turned and walked away. Yalan liked the animals, if only for his brother's sake, but he never liked that they made more money than he did for the troupe. Argy didn't care who made more money, just so long as her troupe stayed together and could afford to stay together and continue their wandering lifestyle. If the monkey were their best act, then the monkey got extra fruit if Calais thought he needed it. "Well, I need to get back to my tents," said Vula. She planted a kiss on Argy's lips, and Argy returned the kiss enthusiastically. Vula's lips were warm and tasted like honey. When they broke apart, Vula laughed again and said, "I look forward to tonight." Argy waved as Vula left, and then went to find Savina. It wasn't like the girl to go wandering off when she had a task to do. She'd been a slave too long to be disobedient. If Argy asked for something from her tent in the middle of a meal, intending only that Savina should fetch it after they were finished eating, Savina would jump up and run off to get whatever Argy wanted before taking another bite. It was going to take some time to ease her into the life of a free person. The others were busy setting up their tents and constructing the makeshift pens for their animals. The smaller animals, like the monkey and the parrot, stayed with Calais in his tent. Argy was just as glad not to have to share her living space with the parrot, as it knew every cuss word in 5 languages and liked to screech them at random times in the night. Beyond the tents and the pens, she saw other colourful tents of the other troops, and a few performers working on their routines. Yallen was engaged in a mock battle with another juggler to see who could keep more objects in the air. If the contest went as such battles usually did, Yallen would win, and the other juggler would owe him a bottle of wine or a few coins. Yallen never competed when money wasn't on the line. The other juggler had a tattoo on her face that marked her as someone from one of the western cities where magic was rife in the population. But acrobatic troupes had a code: no magic. Audiences needed to be entertained by human skill alone. If anyone even suspected this other juggler were using magic, the contest would be forfeit, and Yallen would win automatically. "Sivina," Aji called. She'd seen Yallen compete before. She was more worried about the girl's whereabouts. Where was she? Maori turned to look at her, and she walked over to him. He had just finished setting up her tent and was packing spare ropes away. "You're looking for Sivina?" "Have you seen her?" "No, last time I saw her she was with you." A cheer drew Aji's attention. She saw that Yallen had, as per usual, won the contest and was bowing to the small crowd of fellow performers who had gathered to watch the proceedings. Aji walked over to the group. "Anyone seen a young blonde girl in a blue dress?" she asked. Yallen frowned. "You can't find Sivina?" That got the attention of the juggler Yallen had just vanquished. "You are missing someone too?" she asked. She pushed a strand of sweat-soaked brown hair back over her ear. "One of our tumblers didn't show up to our performance last night, and another troupe's missing an animal tamer." Missing. Aji was struck with a pang of panic that froze her gut despite the heat of the day. Many people might want Sivina for all kinds of horrible purposes. She didn't even want to think about what Sivina had already endured as a slave. Whatever the people in this city had in mind for strangers whom they could find alone could very well be worse. The juggler grew more serious. "I've heard rumours there are more, but when we asked the magistrate about it this morning, she just said that the god of shadows takes people into his house when he wills, and something else about how we should divert our eyes." "What does that mean?" asked Yallen. The juggler frowned. "I don't know. We couldn't get more out of her. All I know is that this god of theirs is creepy. I want to get out of this city, but our leader doesn't want to go before we find Halko." She held out a few coins to Yallen and said, "Most people can't beat me. Maybe we'll be able to try our skills against each other again. I just hope it's somewhere far from here." Aji and Yallen looked at each other. Yallen looked stricken. "We'll get her back," said Aji. "Let's ask Povara about this god of shadows, and then spread out to search. Hopefully we'll have some idea of where to look then." Yallen nodded. They went back to the main tent, where their fire-eater and knife-thrower, Povara, had just laid out some fruit and dried meats. Povara was their oldest and most well-travelled member of the troupe. She'd even been beyond the Eastern Sea and to the distant south, where the stars were different. If anyone might shed light on what was going on, it would be her. Aji ignored the food and sat down on a pile of blankets while she fought to keep her panic at bay. Where was Sivina? How could they find her in this unfamiliar city where the magistrate would be of no assistance? She wanted to run off into the streets, yelling Sivina's name, but she'd travelled enough to be more discreet in an unfamiliar city. She needed information first. Then she could run through the streets. Sivina's wandered off or been taken, And she's not the only one. It seems the locals pin the responsibility on their god of shadows. What do you know about him?" Pavara's eyebrows shot up, and she sat down next to Argy with a muttered curse. Yalan ushered Calais and Maori and the rest of their troupe into the tent. "I don't know much," Pavara said in a tight voice. Her face had gone absolutely blank, as if she fought back a memory she would rather have forgotten. "I first heard of a god of shadows across the eastern sea. He dwelt in a city much like this, in a temple built down in a pit that could only be reached by his particular disciples. The people of that city would bury people alive as sacrifices to him." "Bury them alive?" asked Yalan. He shuddered. Pavara nodded. "I heard of a similar god later in the northern reaches, where the sun disappears for months at a time in the winter. Then the god walks among the people and slowly drains them of their lives. Those that make it until the sun returns over the horizon are considered blessed." "Why would anyone stay in a place like that or worship such a god?" demanded Maori. "At least my people have the sense to worship a goddess who blesses us with strong arms, courageous hearts, and clever minds." "The god brought them great wealth and safety," said Pavara. "You can have fortune and a city secure from attack, so long as you're willing to pay the price." Argy said nothing. Her own people worshipped a plethora of jealous gods who each wanted something different from the people and were often none too nice about making their demands known. They were always testing their followers. Surviving one test was simply what one endured to get to the next. Those gods were never satisfied. She had been more than happy to leave them behind. At least the rigorous training of growing up, being watched and tested constantly, had helped her in her acrobatic training. Her human mentors had never been as cruel as her old gods. "It's a start," said Argy. "If the god of shadows is responsible, he must have a temple somewhere, maybe in a pit. We need to find it." "The gate here is in the southwest quadrant of the city, so we should look to the northeast. That's how it was in the eastern city. The gate and the pit were on opposite sides." "Let's go," said Maori. He stood. "But let's go prepared," said Argy. "If we're going to be dealing with a deep pit, bring ropes and hooks and sources of light. We might be climbing around in complete darkness. Take only what you can tie around your waist or sling over your shoulder." Pavara led the way, with Maori, Calais, Yalan, and Argy close behind. No one hindered them, and they made good time towards the northeast area of the city, where the streets were truly deserted and half the buildings crumbled into dust. An odd veil squatted over the city here thickly, but it wasn't one Argy could see with her eyes. Instead, it seemed just outside of her vision, but heavy and ever-present. Argy blinked several times, but the veil remained. "You feel that?" asked Maori. "What is it?" "The god," said Pavara. "Ignore it. It's just the cloak he casts over himself." The group rounded the last crumbling structure, and nothing stood between them and the Black Mountain except a huge hole in the ground. It had to be several 100 feet across at least. In the center was a pillar whose top was level with street level. It was connected to the surrounding landscape by a bridge only a few finger widths wide. Argy peered down into the abyss. A frightful, menacing something seemed to be peering back at her, but she couldn't focus her eyes on it, not through the veil. "Who here hasn't walked a tightrope before?" asked Yalan. "Even a juggler like me could get over there." "I can't," said Calais. Mary's shoulders sagged. "I'll try, but I haven't done this in years." "I'm going," said Argy. "And me," said Pavara. "That will make 3 of us," said Yalan. "Perhaps Calais and Mary should stay here and keep an eye out for trouble." "Fine," said Argy. "Let's go. Bring what you think you can carry and maintain your balance." "I've got everything I need," said Pavara. She was unusually grim, and her eyes stared ahead as if she was seeing something none of the rest of them could. The look startled Argy a bit. She was used to Pavara being steady and knowledgeable, the kind of person who could answer a question or sit quietly with the sick. But now wasn't the time to think about the past. If the god took people from the city, he brought them here. Savina would be inside. As long as Pavara was coming along, she could look as grim as she wanted. Argy picked up 2 bags of the equipment and held them out away from her body to help her balance. Then she stepped lightly onto the thin stone bridge and concentrated on getting across. She'd done this 1,000 times before, though the drop had never been this long, nor the stakes this high. But the stone stayed firm under her feet in a way that a rope did not, and she made it across quickly. Yalan and Pavara were close behind. Argy looked back toward the city, but it was hidden from her sight now. Pavara saw her gaze. "We are under the god's cloak. You won't see anything outside his mantle until we find our way through." "Fine," said Argy. "I'm not leaving here without Savina anyway." Yalan grabbed the amulet around his neck, and his lips moved in a silent prayer. In his land, everyone had a personal god who watched over them, and whose name was kept private between the individual and the god. Argy had always dismissed Yalan's god. How powerful could a deity be that only had one adherent, and whose name was a secret? But today she added her silent prayers to Yalan's. Any help was better than none at all. In the center of the pillar's top was another pit, this one only 20 or so feet across. Stairs hugged the wall and descended into darkness. "Here," said Pavara. She held up a red crystal, muttered something, and the crystal began to glow brightly. "Magic," hissed Yalan. Pavara glared at him. "I never use it for the show. That doesn't mean I don't know how." "We can use it, Yalan, so let it go," Argy said. She'd overheard Pavara say once or twice when she was very drunk or sick that she could do feats of magic, but she'd never thought too hard about it since it was unimportant for their act. But today was not an act. If Yalan's god or Pavara's magic could help, then Argy was willing to accept the assistance. "Pavara, you go first since you have the light. Yalan, bring up the rear and keep an ear out for anything that might follow us." He grunted. "There's nothing up here." "And people are being snatched in broad daylight with no one seeing a thing," said Argy. "We don't know what kind of powers this god has. Maybe he can transport monsters or his priests behind us, or create them out of thin air, or darkness. I don't know. Do you?" Yalan had nothing to say to that. They descended the stairs for what seemed like a terribly long time, in silence. Archie felt a faint breeze on her cheek. "Wait, Pavara, shine your light around. There's a draught. Where's it coming from?" Pavara lifted the crystal. Above their heads was a hole that was too small for Maori to get through, but the three of them would have no problem. Archie missed Maori's strength and support, but it was just as well he hadn't come. "Our way in," said Archie. She reached into one of her bags and got out the chalk dust. She, Pavara and Yalan dusted their hands well. "Here," said Pavara. She reached into a pocket and gave Archie a globular candle of the kind sold in Salandran bazaars. They were magic of a sort, generally only good for pranks, because they sputtered and cast light of strange and oddly shifting colours. But it was better than nothing. Archie put the purple wad of wax in her mouth. Climbing a rock wall wasn't nearly as hard as some of the skills she'd had to develop over the years, but it was one she didn't practice a lot. Archie felt around carefully for the best grip, and carefully began her climb. Fortunately, the rough-hewn wall offered plenty of places for her fingertips to get a good grip. The entrance wasn't difficult to get to, but it was pitch black inside. Pavara's tiny light was behind her. Archie wormed her way through the tunnel a few feet, but then her questing hands closed over nothing. A drop-off. Archie scooted forward and looked down. This might be a good place for a little light, no matter how odd. She spit out the Salandran candle, tapped it against the rock wall 3 times, and whispered the nonsense words, "Akri bizi no chuizi." The ball of wax instantly began to glow a sickly green. Good enough. Archie dropped it through the hole. The candle landed only about 10 to 12 feet below her, and by its flickering glow, Archie saw a chair and a small table, both covered in layers of dust. A room that went unused for years was liable to be as safe as anywhere in this complex. Archie dropped through the hole and landed lightly by the chair. After a few moments, Yalan followed. Pavara came through last, more clumsily than the others. Pavara had never been an acrobat. Yalan picked up the candle from the floor. "Now what?" The door to the room creaked open, and they froze. Someone must have noted the light. Pavara hefted 2 of her throwing knives. Archie clamped her mouth shut and tried not to scream. She hated herself for her fear. She'd never get to Savina if she gave in to fright at the first sign of trouble. A familiar face poked around the corner into the room. Vula. Her face was ghastly pale in the green light of the candle. "Vula?" asked Archie. She rushed forward to embrace the other woman. Vula seemed equally shocked to see them, and she stepped back before Archie could touch her. "That's it. I'm going crazy," she said. Her wide, frightened eyes stared at Archie unbelieving. "No," said Archie. "We're here to find Savina." Vula blinked slowly. After a few moments, her eyes focused on Archie's and she nodded. Finally, a small smile crept over her face. "Well, that proves we think alike. I'm here looking for Imber." "This god of shadows takes a lot of people," muttered Pavara. "Have you found anyone yet?" asked Yalan. Vula shook her head. "No, I think we have to find a way down to the lowest levels." "Then let's go," said Archie. You can tell us anything you've discovered about this place on the way." The four of them went out into the corridor. Between the candle in Yalan's hand and the crystal in Pavara's, they could see well enough to make out the rough-hewn walls and the dusty floor. The corridor curved to the left, no doubt to stay within the confines of the circular pillar that housed this dreadfully dark place. "I haven't found out much," said Vula. "I came across that skinny bridge at the top. Since then I've been inside. Every so often I hear voices, but when I go in that direction, I'll find nothing but blank walls. Sometimes it's as if something covers my eyes. Even in the darkness, I can sense this veil. Then it moves on. I don't know what's down here, but it scares me. I feel faint whenever it's near." Argy shuddered to hear Vula admit to fear. She had never known the other woman to be afraid of anything, and the hollow way Vula talked about this place was almost more frightening than the place itself. Finally, they found a staircase. Despite her earlier protestations of fear, Vula began descending quickly. "Vula, be careful," hissed Argy, but the other woman did not listen. "Imba," she called, "Imba." "Hush," said Yalan. "Too late," said Pravara. "Well, anyone at the bottom would have seen our lights anyway." "Let's follow her," said Argy. "There's no one up here, even if Vula said she heard voices earlier." They descended the stairs. The sound of Vula's feet on the stone steps became more and more difficult to hear as she got farther ahead of them. But Argy wasn't willing to risk going faster in the desperate darkness. "I've been thinking about something Vula said," said Pabara. "Yes?" "She said she felt faint when this darkness covered her eyes. In some cities there's a fainting god, but he sounds very much like the shadow god." "A fainting god? I've never heard of such a thing," snorted Yalan. "This god was responsible for injury and illness," said Pavara, as if Yalan hadn't interrupted her. "But once in a while he was the god of extreme blessing and healing. So if a city were hit by a plague, he got the blame. But if one person who was crippled suddenly walked, he got the credit." "Sort of like how this god of shadows takes people, but also brings wealth to those who are left?" asked Argy. "I guess so. And once I heard a tale of a god of darkness that liked to keep cities under the hem of his cloak. The older tales are from farther east, and then later jump the ocean, as if this god is marching across the world, one city at a time." A strange, flickering green light came from somewhere below them. "The bottom of the stairs?" asked Yalan. Argy steeled herself and continued on, trying to hurry as much as she dared on the steep staircase. "Let's hope so, and pray to your God that Savina is there." "I am," he said tersely. "My God will not let us down." Argy kept her skepticism to herself. She wanted to believe that Yalan could compel some supernatural assistance, but even if Yalan's God existed and wanted to help, would he be able to do anything here, in the pit of the god of shadows? You might be a decently powerful god on your own, but did that mean you could just walk into another god's house and defeat him in his own domain? The stairs got significantly less steep, and suddenly each one was several feet wide. Then, finally, the last step down onto a round platform. They must be in the very center, toward the bottom of the pillar. Vula was there, staring down into darkness at the edge of the platform. "There's more down," she said with disgust. It's as if this god lives in the center of the earth. Do we have more candles? Asked Argy. She held out her hand. Pavara gave her another Salandran joke candle. Argy activated it and held it out. This one pulsed a pink light that occasionally sparked out red, then returned to pink. The pink light mixed with the green one of the candle Yalan held and the yellow of the crystal in Pavara's hand in an unsettling way, as if this place weren't frightening enough as it was. The light showed that the four of them stood in the middle of the pit. This time there was no thin bridge to walk across. The far wall was lost in the darkness. None of their lights could illuminate this entire space. Now what? Asked Yalan. Inma, shouted Vula. She turned to Argy, her head held at an odd angle. Do you hear them? Listen. Argy listened carefully. The air moving around them made a shing sound as it travelled through this vast area, but she did not hear voices. Savina! She shouted. Vula and their lights had already betrayed their presence. No need for secrecy now. Look, said Pavara, coming toward us. Argy blinked because her eyes seemed to be deceiving her. In front of them, in mid-air, stood a black figure, so dark that it stood out even in this place of darkness. The abyss dropped away below it. Who are you? Asked Argy. What have you done with Savina and the others? Those who obey do not come here, said a hollow voice. Those that do not may be noticed by the god. I'm sure we didn't obey. Why weren't we brought here? The god takes those whom he notices. A vision of the streets around the market filled Argy's mind. People walking veiled, eyes on the ground, hardly speaking to one another, as if doing their best to be invisible. Everyone so intent on their own desire to be less noticeable than everyone else. No one made any trouble. No need for a city guard. Who would make trouble and draw the god's attention on purpose? I suppose that means the people of this city want outsiders here, said Argy. More people who don't obey the rules and can be noticed more easily. No answer to that. Is Savina here? The black form hovered in front of them, as still as a leaf on a windless day. What about Muranos? Shouted Pavara. He was buried alive for you. How can you justify that? Argy's heart skipped a beat, then pounded painfully against her ribs. She turned to Pavara, whose face had been transformed into a grotesque mask of rage and grief. Pavara! But the other woman did not seem to hear or see anyone else anymore. She walked to the edge of the platform and held her crystal out in front of her. I've prayed for years to find a way to get my revenge against you, for his sake. Yalan, looking alarmed, reached for Pavara's arm, but she shrugged him aside and pulled out a small vial of the kind of oil she used for the part of her act she called dragonfire, which involved spitting coloured flames into the air. She bit open the vial, took the oil into her mouth and spat it toward the dark figure. Then she tossed her crystal into what should have been the figure's face. A brief flame sputtered, but the figure appeared unaffected. Pavara, stop, said Argy. We need to find Savina. She moved toward the other woman, but Pavara was as one possessed. She pushed Argy aside, pulled out another vial and tossed its contents into her mouth. Then she took something else out of her pocket, leaped into the void, and wrapped her arms around the dark figure. Flames burst into life. Pavara screamed as her clothing caught on fire, but she did not let go. Within moments, her form had been consumed by flames, and then, as Arji watched in horror, the darkness swallowed her entirely. Only the echo of her last scream remained. For long moments, the sound bounced around her head before fading into the distance. Arji sank to her knees, her head pounding with fear, her heart shattered. Everything here was madness. She wished she had never heard of Tezeran. She could have taken another job, found another way to survive. Her people would all have been as safe as she could make them. What kind of upside-down place was this, where God's 8 people and decent, calm women like Pavara turned into raging lunatics in the dark? What would you have of the God that he has not already given you? Asked the hollow voice. Give us our friend back, said Yalan. She has the revenge she desired and the death she prayed for, said the hollow voice. What about you? Do you desire revenge? How about returning Imba to me? Screamed Vula. That's what I want. You already have what you want, said the voice. Arji looked over at Vula, who was clearly confused. What? But I want Imba. You wanted a second chance. You have had that, and you have returned to us as we said you would. Arji's heart sank. How did you get here? She asked Vula. I told you, said Vula angrily. I came across the bridge and then I searched this place. But how did you get in? What do you mean? Did you go down some steps, climb a rock wall, slither through small holes? No, I just... Arji closed her eyes, unable to look at her friend's face any longer. You were never much of a tightrope walker, Vula. You fell. I did not, said Vula, though her voice now held a hint of doubt. Perhaps she was remembering that fatal slip, the fall, the air rushing past her face as she plummeted toward the bottom of the pit. I didn't. Now it was little more than a whine. You haven't needed a light here like we did, said Arji. You hear voices we can't. You don't look quite normal. I thought it was just the light from the candles, because it can play tricks on you. But it's not that. Hot tears welled up in her eyes and spilled over onto her cheeks. What else could this cruel god demand of them? What is your desire, woman? Asked the voice. Arji almost blurted out that she demanded Savina be returned to her, but she stopped herself. This is a test. This god is like the gods of your people. You know it to be true. The god was testing them. She was sure of it. The citizens of the city were required to conform to arbitrary rules. Those that didn't might be snatched to see what they would do or what their loved ones would do. Those that sought out the god had to face tests such as the bridge and the darkness, and at last, should they make it to the god or his representative here in the pit, they had to articulate what had driven them here to begin with. Tests without end. "And you," said the voice, "what is your desire?" Argy kept her mouth shut. "Just tell him and let's go," said Yalan. Argy heard the fear and the tears in his voice. He had already failed and didn't even know it. Vula had failed. Povara had failed. They had all voiced their desires to the god when it had demanded they name their desires. No doubt Savina had failed, and Argy's heart quailed at the thought. But she would not fail, at least not so easily. Argy looked up. The dark form had come slightly closer. Argy wanted to mock it, to let it know she wouldn't play this game, but perhaps even speaking with it would make her fail the test. Her silence was her best weapon. "Name your desire," said the voice. There was an essence of begging in it, or perhaps that was her imagination. "Just tell it," said Yalan. Argy stood firm. The dark form drew closer. The cold that emanated from it made her shiver, but she held her ground. "Name your desire," it said again. Argy did not obey. This thing couldn't make her fail the test. She'd have to do that herself. She'd learned that much as a child. Gods could only put the traps in front of you, but you were the one who had to step in them on your own. The dark form was right in front of her now. Argy couldn't stop shivering, but she did not turn away or say anything. A low moaning started all around her. Yalan shrieked and then yelled, "There's no stairs! Where did the stairs go?" Vula's body crumpled in on itself. Her limbs twisted as if she were returning to her post-fall state. Argy's heart shrieked in grief while Vula screamed, "No!" and leaped into the void. But Argy did not move, no matter how much her heart hurt, how much her eyes watered. Grief was another test. That she would never see Vula or Povara again was hard, so hard. But Savina, she had to focus on Savina, and the slim chance that somehow, if she found a way to pass the test, she and Yalan and Savina could walk out of here together. The darkness swallowed her. Argy heard only the blood ringing in her ears, reminding her she was alive. Cold seeped into every part of her. "I will give you whatever you want," said a voice in her head. The timbre was different than the dark form had used earlier. Perhaps this was the god himself. Argy did not respond. Visions crept into her head. Her troupe, laughing together over a meal. Maori saying something funny, and Calais howling and red in the face. The rest of them equally amused by Maori's joke and Callan's reaction. Savina, learning to walk on the tightrope, beaming with pleasure when she managed it without a spotter or any safety equipment. Argy's heart swelled with pride and love. A young man Argy did not recognize, dark of face and hair, but lanky and limber and an expert at pole-sitting and knife-throwing. His white teeth gleamed in the sun as he smiled at her. Was the god telling her she could survive, and this man would be part of her troupe one day? He looked like Maori, but also like her. Could he be her son? What did the god really want from her? Was it all a trick? She felt as if she were walking on the edge of a knife. Balance was key, but darkness surrounded her on all sides. She did as her old tightrope walking teacher had told her. Keep your eyes fixed on one spot. Go slowly and relax. Find your balance. She'd fallen a lot. Everyone did. But eventually she'd learned how to walk on the rope, even do somersaults on the dismount. Her teacher had been pleased. Her goal was to maintain silence. That would do for her horizon. Other than that, she needed to endure and not stiffen. The god could pummel her with demands and with cold, but he was not in control of her mind. She was. The visions changed. Her troope's tent being set afire by troops from the south, Calais running forward towards the soldiers as they impaled his animals on their spears, then being impaled himself, dying while reaching for the body of the monkey that lay close by. Maori on the ground in chains, blood covering his face. Savina being dragged behind a tent by a soldier who was already ripping off her clothing. Argie opened her mouth to scream, prepared to run forward, to snatch Savina from the soldier or die trying. To comfort Maori if she could. To find the rest of them. Where was Yalan? Where were the others? She had to find them, protect them. If necessary, die with them. They were her family. No, she could not. The god could not make her respond. She stayed on the edge of the knife and refused to be baited. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done. She wanted to step forward so much. The vision faded. Something touched her on the face. It was cold and slimy and wrapped itself around her head. Somehow it slithered down her throat and into her gut. Argie wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to fight this. But that would be failing the test. She had to endure. If her childhood gods had taught her nothing else, she had learned endurance. The cold, slimy thing settled in her body, as if nestling itself against her organs. "You are ours," said the voice. "Give voice to us, and we will spread our seed throughout the land." The air around her shifted and grew slightly warmer. A strange pulsing in her bones started from her feet and crept up her body. Another test? Suddenly, the darkness was gone, and she stood on the top of the pillar, along with Savina and Yalan. Other people stood or sat all around them, some healthy-looking, others mere skeletons with skin stretched over them. They must be the people the god had been consuming and had released. Argie hoped Halko and Imber were among them. But where was the most important person of all? "Argie!" screamed Savina from behind her. Argie whirled around, arms open, and Savina leapt into the embrace. Argie's tears burst forth, but she kept her silence. Letting everyone go was another test. The god could call those people back and finish consuming them at any time, but it wanted Argie to think it was beaten, broken. She knew better. Yalen's eyes were wide. "Can we leave? Is it over? Is she all right?" Argy felt a compulsion to leave this place, not just wanting to flee a frightening god and this awful city, but to leave, to find somewhere else to be, somewhere the god was not, somewhere this formless seed inside her could take root in another city, begin growing and taking more people, testing them, consuming them. "What's wrong?" asked Yalen as she didn't respond. "Give voice to us." No, Argy would not do that. That must be how the shadow god had moved across the ocean, had found his place wherever someone could be forced to carry his seed to new lands. She looked at Yalen and smiled slightly, but said nothing. She wouldn't give voice to this god, no matter what. She pointed toward the bridge and pushed Savina toward Yalen. "No!" screamed Savina. Yalen wrapped his arms around Savina's narrow shoulders. "I'll get her across, then I'll come back for you." Argy watched him usher Savina to the bridge and disappear into the god's mantle that blocked the city from her sight. Now it was just the two of them. She walked to the edge and sat down, feet dangling over the abyss where Vula had died. She wasn't moving until the god released her. "What can I give you? Name your desire." The voice sounded slightly desperate now, but Argy would not budge. All at once, awful visions and feelings filled her head. Fire, blood, boiling seas, terrible thirst, unendurable grief. Agony that swelled her joints and rattled her teeth. Argy wanted to writhe away from the pain, to run from it. But she had to walk the edge of the knife, find her balance. In her mind, she found the center of her being, where she kept her love for her friends. She called to mind each one of their faces. Maori, Yalen, Calais, Savina, and those she had lost, Povara, Vula. The god howled at her, pummeled her mind, made her dizzy with cold and pain and madness. But she kept the faces of her loved ones before her and stared only at them. That was the first rule of walking the tightrope. Find a point in the distance. Focus on it. Do not look down. The rage of the god grew. Argy bent forward from the weight of his anger and his determination. She did not give him the satisfaction of a response. He stared ahead and saw Savina's bright blue eyes in a sunny face that would one day be happy in truth rather than simply in trained response. She recalled the face of the man the god had taunted her with, the one that looked like both Maori and her. Perhaps he might be part of her life someday. Someone to love and guide, someone to give the troupe to when she and Maori were too old and stiff to continue the travelling acrobatic life. Balance. She had never been the natural Savina was, but long years of practice had made her an expert. She could sit here and balance on the edge, and the god could not force her to do otherwise, any more than the gods of her ancestors had been able to force her into anything. If she even suspected he would win, she would lean forward a tiny bit more and meet Vula's fate at the bottom of the abyss. The cold thing in her gut slithered back and forth, agitated. But she would not carry it to another city, to destroy another population. The god would have to spread his seed without Argy's assistance. She pictured Savina again, as she might look in a few years, walking the rope, juggling, throwing knives at targets, doing all the things the troupe could teach her, becoming a full-fledged member and not just an indentured servant. Even if Argy and Maori never had a child, Savina could be the one to carry on their legacy. The future held so much promise, but only if she held firm. She would be free of the god, or she would die here. No other option existed. If the god were powerful enough, he'd be able to read her intent. He would know there is no leaving this city inside Argy. The thing in her gut punched her in the heart, but she did not give voice to her pain. It slammed itself into her ribs, now seemingly panicked. It rammed the back of her throat, almost shrieking in its frustration and terror. She opened her mouth, and the thing shot out of her. Instantly, she felt weaker and almost slipped forward. But someone grabbed her shoulder. Argy! It was Maori. Maori! He'd said he couldn't manage the bridge. Argy looked up, afraid to speak. But Maori answered her unspoken question anyway. I couldn't fail you just because I was afraid of the bridge. Even after Yalan told us what happened to Vula, I was going to come for you or die trying. He threw his arms around her. Argy looked around. The light was wrong. It was morning, or she had her directions confused. The thing within her was gone, and the god's mantle had dissipated. How long? Her voice broke, as if she hadn't used it in a long time. 2 days, he said. It took that long for us to find the bridge again. The god was hiding it. Then, a few minutes ago, it just dissolved. The whole city shimmered for a moment, as if being illuminated by another sun, and then that disappeared, and the city looked normal. But it feels different. Something has left. Argy blinked. The pit was still too deep to see the bottom, but it no longer held any menace. She twisted to look behind her, but the stairwell at the center of the pillar had disappeared. The god was gone, somehow. Perhaps he had merely moved on, but Tezeran was no longer under his cursed presence. Argy tried to stand, but she was weak. Yalan gave her some bread and water, which helped. Maori got her to her feet. Yalan tied the three of them together with a rope so that the two of them could aid a wobbly-kneed Argy across to safety. Once she was there, Savina sobbed and threw her arms around Argy's waist. For the first time, she saw Savina's true face, and it brought tears to her eyes. Something's different, said Yalan. Better. Yes, said Argy. I walked the tightrope and didn't fall. She smiled at his confusion. She'd explain it later. And then, once they had left this city behind and found another to perform in, she would consider going to other cities where the god had squatted his foul presence on the people. Perhaps she could drive him out of other places, perhaps even back across the sea, or at the very least find a guild of sages and tell them how she'd done it, so that they could spread the word. That was for the future. For now, she had a troupe to return to, and a life with friends and love. Home.